Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 5 as we look at the third portion of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. And so we left off here with Luther, and we just have a little bit left with him, but essentially, to rehash quickly, Luther, his official break with Catholicism didn't come till 1520 when he wrote The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. Essentially, Luther was now going after the official doctrines, the actual church teachings. And this ultimately caused him to get excommunicated, kicked out of the church. And then the following year, he's summoned by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms, the gathering in Worms, Germany, to explain his views. His opponent is Cardinal Cajetan. Luther essentially loses in the debate, and he is declared by the Holy Roman Emperor to be outside the law, which means if somebody was to kill Luther, they would suffer no punishment for doing so. But Luther had a protector in Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, the Prince of Saxony, who again protected Luther, so he was able to continue with his ministry. In terms of theology, Luther felt that other individuals would see things as he did, and when these individuals did not, they would often experience Luther's legendary temper. Um, I took a class when I was in graduate school, and I think the name of the course was called Ozark Congregations. And I could have observed my own faith community, my own church, if I wanted to, but I wanted to give myself something of a challenge, but I wanted to be in an environment where I would feel comfortable in. So I decided to observe a Lutheran church, as one of my former professors was a Lutheran, ordained Lutheran, and I observed her church, which is was Prince of Peace Lutheran, and I met with the pastor, Jim. Pastor Jim is his name, and he, was telling me how, we see Luther as, essentially our great teacher, but he had his flaws. And one of those flaws was essentially his temper. Um, I mentioned earlier how, like regarding the Bible, I made the statement, well, what about this passage versus this passage? Well, Luther never really completely thought about such things. I mean, he would know what it is I was talking about. If I was to, have this conversation with him, he would know what I'm talking about. But, he thought, and maybe a lot of it had to do certainly with the fact he had a doctorate in theology. But, he thought people would just see things as, he did, that, he just might need to explain it a bit, but then they would come and they would understand that, he's right. Well, that's not how history played out. And, you know, individuals experienced Luther's temper. He would blow up at people if after a while they just didn't see things, as he did. Kind of an example of that a little bit more. After Luther's break with Catholicism, he wrote a treatise titled That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. And essentially, the main point of this treatise was how the Jewish people always wanted to become Christian, but when they saw how corrupt the church was, that kept them from doing so. But now that the corruption has been fixed by Luther, in his own mind anyway, Jews would come into the church in massive numbers. Well, of course, that didn't happen. So, near the end of his life, Luther wrote another treatise titled On the Jews and Their Lies, and he mentioned things about how, their synagogues should be destroyed, how the Talmud should be burned. Luther really hated the Talmud and that type of thing. And centuries later, Adolf Hitler declared how Luther's work on the Jews and their lies was one of the great writings of German literature. And, after the Second World War and the effects of the Holocaust, um, Lutheran bodies of various spectrums issued an apology to the Jewish people for Luther's rhetoric. Well, moving on, we have now John Calvin, the Frenchman. Calvin, he's born in Nyon, France in 1509. His father, Gerard, was the apostolic secretary to the bishop of the Nyon diocese. One of the jobs that Calvin's father, Gerard, had, being the apostolic secretary, was that of the bookkeeper. Money coming into the diocese and leaving the diocese. And this is something that would have an effect later on, well, both his father and Calvin himself. In his late teen years, Calvin, he enrolls as a seminarian, but eventually he decided to leave the priesthood to become a lawyer. So Calvin, in this regard, is kind of the opposite of Luther. Luther went off to university to become a lawyer, but then he had his thunderstorm experience where he makes an intercessory prayer to Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, asking, for her intercession to God, her grandson, Jesus Christ, and how if he's allowed to make it home safely, he'll become a monk. And so he does so. And then a couple of years later, Luther is ordained to the priesthood. Calvin was different. He decided, went off to school to become a priest, but then decided that this was not for him. And so he decides to go into law. But of course, I mentioned, back then, everybody, if you were lucky enough to go to university, everybody took courses on theology because theology was viewed as the science of sciences. I do think when I've read some of Calvin's works and some of the points he makes about certain issues, in this case specifically with Catholic theology, I do wonder if some of those statements might have been done because he did not, but in any case. While he's studying law in 1531, Calvin's father dies and is not given a proper burial. So, what exactly happens with Calvin's father? Well, I mentioned that one of the jobs that Calvin's father Gerard had was as the bookkeeper for the diocese. And it turns out that there was money missing from the diocese. And his father essentially was accused of embezzling money, that is, stealing money from the church. And he ended up being excommunicated from the church. And because of this, he was not given a massive Christian burial or even just the funeral liturgy. Um, One of the things that historians have pointed out and was referenced with his father is that his father could have arguably been suffering from dementia. Basically, yes, money went missing, but it wasn't really his fault. And historians have also wondered if this caused Calvin to take the route that he did. We don't know for certain if that was the case until perhaps maybe more evidence comes out, like perhaps we find a writing from Calvin where he states, yeah, I was angry at how they treated my father and I didn't want to have anything to do with the church anymore. But we won't know that until we see that evidence. But historians have speculated that maybe what happened to his father caused him to go the route that he did. Well, in any case, by 1534, just a few years later, Calvin, he's fully engaged in the Protestant movement and he has to flee France. Since Christianity was first introduced to France, it has always essentially been a Catholic country. Um, there was a period of time where the Gnostic form of Christianity, or particular form of Gnosticism, did have some strength, as Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, one of his major works against heresies, tackles the Gnostics. So more than likely, there were certain Gnostics around him and his diocese. Also, the Arian form of Christianity did have some strength for a while in France, but overall, it's essentially been a Catholic country. Even though there has been periods of time where a form of Calvinism, or Calvinists called the Huguenots, have been a significant minority in France, but overall, it's been a predominantly Catholic country, and Calvin was forced to flee France. Well, then a few years later, 1536, Calvin, he arrives in Geneva, Switzerland, and he would remain there for the rest of his life. And Geneva essentially became this Calvinist theocracy. So Calvin was for a couple of years this wandering Protestant preacher, you could say, and he arrives in Geneva and he preaches there, and the people of Geneva are like, you can't leave, you have to stay. So Calvin stays and he's there for the rest of his life, and Geneva essentially becomes this Calvinist theocracy. Calvin was known for issuing fines to those that would violate his teachings. And to kind of add that a little bit more, one of my former professors mentioned how he took a group of students to Geneva, and the tour guide was telling them all the things that they were going to see. And my one professor, Dr. Barty, he raised his hand and said, "Are you going to show us anything related to John Calvin?" And the tour guide said, "Well, sure, if you'd like." So they took them to St. Peter's Church, which is where Calvin preached from, and they showed them the pulpit that he preached from and the chair that he sat in. But if Dr. Barty would not have mentioned Calvin, asked about him, Calvin would not have been on the tour. Geneva sees itself as this very open city, and they see a lot of Calvin's theology as basically the antithesis of that. Well, we're going to need to stop here, but when we come back, we will look at Calvin a little bit more.